Welcome to Technoskeptical, where we discuss the psychological and spiritual aspects of technology, society, and power. I'm Alex Fox. My guest today is Patrick Van Horne, author of Left of Bang and founder of the CP Journal. Patrick started off in the Marine Corps, where he first learned how to use force to respond to danger, and later how to use foresight to avoid it. He now teaches that skill to people all over the world. Join us on a fascinating conversation about the journey from force to foresight. Stay tuned.
There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy.
Where are the hidden levers of power? Who pulls the strings?
What is going on are consciousness wars.
Public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
Their objective is to gain an absolute monopoly over all sources of power. What cannot be controlled must be undermined and destroyed.
We need more understanding of human nature because the only real danger that exists is man himself.
Patrick Van Horne, thank you so much for joining me here today on Technoskeptical. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Alex.
Why don't we get started with an easy question? We'll just have you maybe tell us a little bit about your background and where you are now in your current role professionally.
Sounds good. So I'm the co-author of a book called Left of Bang, which talks about the Marine Corps Combat Hunter program, which I imagine we'll talk about today, and the co-founder of a company called the CP Journal. I started my career not too long after September 11th, going into the Marine Corps. And then after I finished my service, I had the chance to start my company, and I work with both organizations and individuals and communities who are preparing for or preventing or in responding to disasters and incidents and acts of violence.
So that's a pretty serious role. Now, you mentioned the Combat Hunter program. Tell me a little bit about the Combat Hunter program and then maybe lead into the book you wrote based on that experience.
Absolutely. And the book Left of Bang, it tells the story of the Marine Corps Combat Hunter program. And in 2007, this was a program that was created by then Marine General James Mattis, who went on to become our Secretary of Defense. But the program was built to address, some of the challenges and the obstacles that Marines were facing overseas. And the short version of the story, is that in March 2003, the American military stepped off on Operation Iraqi Freedom. Only 21 days later, the American military occupied Baghdad. We had moved faster, moved further while taking fewer casualties than any military has ever done in history. And in response to this, our adversaries, our enemy, learned very quickly that if they wanted to avoid detection, they had to take off their uniform. They had to blend back in with the local population. And when they did that, Marines on the ground, we faced a huge problem of identifying who out there was targeting us, who out there was planning attacks on Marines. And the cycle that really started once the shift happened was we became very reactive to everything the enemy was doing. We would wait to get shot at. We would wait, for that roadside bomb, to be detonated so that we could do our job. And you don't have to be Napoleon to realize this is a horrible, strategy and approach, to the military, to have your troops wait to get shot at just to react and just to respond. And the Combat Hunter program was designed to address that. It taught Marines, how do you read human behavior? How do you read the environment? How do you enhance your situational awareness to not wait for that attack to occur, but to be able to identify those one or two people in the crowd that are out there targeting you and planning their attacks and getting ready to launch their attacks? And the Marine Corps the Marines on the ground really started to shift the way that we approached and the way that we thought about not only how do we fight, but also how do we prepare to take that advantage away from our enemies.
So obviously it came out of a military environment, but it seems like what you did with Left of Bang, which was quite novel, was to adapt those principles for the everyday man or woman who wants to be safer, or I would say maybe take some responsibility for their own personal safety. Talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. And, kind of how this shift happened was, I remember there was a Marine Reserve unit who was coming through the Combat Hunter course before they deployed. And I remember talking to these Marines who, in their civilian job, in their civilian life, they're police officers. And I remember, talking to a few of them saying, hey, we're so happy we had this course. Like, we learned a ton in this program, before we deploy. But I'm working 3, 4, 5 days a week in Southeast, Los Angeles, in these really, tough areas. And we don't get any of this. And it was the first moment where I realized that there was not just this need and for Marines and soldiers and sailors heading overseas, but there were people, here at home that could benefit from the same type of structure of learning. How do you use human behavior? How do you observe your environment to get ahead, to not wait for that attack to occur? And as I separated from the Marines and started our company, we started off with training police officers, and that just started, kind of a sequence of events where we'd get a chance to work with police officers and corporate security teams, but also everyday civilians and people who just want to not, wait to be attacked, or to regain some confidence that they can protect themselves and they can be able to control, whether they're going to be the victim of the attack or they can have that awareness before something bad happens to them.
So for people that aren't familiar with the term left of bang, maybe just explain that real quick.
Absolutely. When you think about whatever event you don't want to happen to you, that is bang, right? When you take bang and you place it on timeline, it's time zero. It's right in the middle of that line. When we talk about getting left of bang, what we're talking about is shifting earlier on that timeline, where you as a person have the ability to look out at your surroundings and recognize those pre-event indicators, those warning signs that exist that let you know bang is about to occur, and to provide you with enough time to actually do something about it. When you're right of bang, it means you are recognizing the attack or the incident or whatever it is that you were focused on only after it has begun. And when you start reacting to something that's already started, you're already behind the curve. The enemy or your adversary or the attacker or whatever you're dealing with has the upper hand, and you're trying to gain it back. And so by shifting left to bang, what we're talking about, it's the confidence and the ability to come into a situation, have a very deliberate and intentional approach to understand your, the baseline of the area that you're in, begin to methodically search your surroundings to figure out, is this the 99% of our life, here at home where we are safe, we don't have anything to worry about? Or is there someone or something here that probably deserves a little more attention as well? And so that shift left to bang is really about teaching people the how to recognize those indicators and those warning signs before something bad actually occurs.
So one of the things that I like a lot about your system and the way that you teach it is that it has some overlap with, let's say, Jeff Cooper's color code, which people are probably familiar with, condition green, condition yellow, and so forth. But it's much more sophisticated in the sense that it isn't just, okay, have your head on a swivel, right? It actually tells you what to look for. You mentioned pre-event indicators. Talk a little bit about what that is. Maybe give me an example from your own experience when you were in the Marines or daily life.
When you think about Cooper's color code, there's a couple of conditions that are in here. And for anyone who's not familiar, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Cooper identified a set of conditions that kind of determine how aware you are of your surroundings and how much you're focusing on anything specific around you. And what condition yellow is, it's a person who's he refers to as a relaxed alert. You know that there's bad things and bad people and bad stuff out there, and you're searching for it, but you haven't found it just yet. When you go up to condition orange, this is when you're in a specified alert. You found that thing that doesn't make sense, and you begin to do some planning or dig into a little further, try to figure out, well, what am I going to do about it? And then you have condition red, where you're beginning to implement whatever plan you came up with in condition orange. And, I always kind of joke about this when we work with different, military branches, but we were Marines. This process had to be simple in order to, elevate us from condition yellow to condition orange. And the way that we were taught and the way that we teach how to do it, is you start by establishing a baseline for any area that you go into. And there's a number of different what we call pillars or domains of behavior, whether you're looking at individuals or groups or the environment or kind of a collective mood. But you start by establishing what is normal here. And just to use an example, if we're assessing individual people, every person at every moment in time can be categorized in one of four ways. Their behavior shows that they're either dominant, submissive, uncomfortable, or comfortable. Every person at every moment in time is in one of these four clusters. And when you establish a baseline, let's say it's a mall or a coffee shop or a restaurant, chances are that the baseline is people who are comfortable. And these are people who don't perceive stresses or threats in their surroundings. What that means is we are then looking for the anomaly, the thing that stands out from that baseline. And it's simply anything other than the comfortable cluster. So we're looking for people whose behavior shows that they're either displaying dominance or discomfort or submissiveness. just something that is different. And that is just the trigger and the threshold for us to say, this person, we don't know why just yet. We can't jump to a conclusion, but there's something different about this person that's ultimately guided and influenced by their response to stress and oftentimes their intentions for being in an area. So the way that we teach it is you establish a baseline. And once you know it's normal, you can begin your search for those things that are not normal, those people that are not fitting into that baseline for the situation you're in.
So that begs the question, what is normal anymore? I mean, I feel like looking at society since 2020, it seems like those anomalies have become the baseline, like there is no normal. We were already dealing with political polarization and kind of algorithmic radicalization from social media and so forth. And then with COVID, those trends sort of got put on steroids. It's like the old curse, may you live in interesting times.
Yeah, it certainly requires more attention, and there's more false positives today than there maybe was before. And I don't know, I can't say that empirically or with data, but it feels that way, that whether people who are uncomfortable being in public or unsure of how to put their phone down and have a normal face-to-face conversation with someone, you watch people who that face-to-face interaction causes them anxiety, and so you'll start to see some pacifying behavior and uncomfortable cues, and it'll attract your attention. Then it's going into the process of trying to figure out what is the reason, what is causing them to behave this way. And so there's certainly more false positives than than I noticed maybe before COVID, specifically when that kind of unfortunately reset a lot of those social interactions for us.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now, one of the reasons that I decided to start this podcast in particular is because as I've gotten older, I've become more aware of not just what you're talking about, which is sort of the physical sense of safety or security, but kind of the spiritual dimension of life. And I don't mean that in a religious way necessarily. I think it could be religious for some people, but in the sense that there's a larger meaning to the things that we do. Sigmund Freud was an atheist, but he described what I would call spiritual warfare as the struggle between our instinct for life, love, and connection, and the death instinct, which urges us to dominate and destroy. And it seems to me, Patrick, that you are a person that has dedicated yourself to the life instinct. You were a warrior, trained to use force, but you gravitated to the use of foresight instead. And I'm fascinated by that evolution from force to foresight, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that journey, and whether you think of it in purely material terms like Freud, or whether you feel that it is your part to play in maybe a more cosmic sense.
I do believe it's, the role that I was meant to play. And, when I think about it, you think about our military, right? It's remarkable to stop and think that the United States, right? We have an all volunteer force, right? And stop, and you pause and you think about what that means. People in this country, they don't have to go fight for our country if they don't want to. And that hasn't always been the case. And that's certainly not the case in a lot of other countries around the world. And there's pros and cons, to this. But everyone serving today has signed up. They have chosen this path. They've chosen to serve something larger than them, oftentimes at their own risk. And in my opinion, and it's just one person's opinion, Alex, but it's, the way that we say thank you to that. It's not, having a hometown hero stand up in the middle of a sports game for applause. It's not, the NFL with their camouflage towels in the month of November. The way that we should be appreciating those people who've chosen to do something bigger than them is by giving everything that they need to succeed in this world, not holding anything back. And that's, all the tools, all the education, the experiences. They should be getting the best education on how to make decisions under high stress environments with critical consequences for getting it wrong. This should be a PhD level program. And this should be supported by academic institutions and industry and society and culture as a whole, not just the round of applause. And when I look at the things that I do in my company or my job today, a lot of what I teach and a lot of what I talk about are simply the things that I wish I was taught earlier in my career, the things that I wish I was taught earlier in my time in the Marines. I didn't see the Combat Hunter program until after I had completed my deployments to Iraq, and that really angered me to come back and think about some of the experiences that we had and some of the the challenge that we faced, and to realize here's a program that was teaching Marines not what to think, but how to think. How do you establish this baseline? How do you go through this process where when you use force, it's targeted and it's very specific. And when you can take, when you can have that, that foresight, as you mentioned, you think about, that focus. It says when we're going to use it, it's going to be for the right purposes, and it's not going to be indiscriminate. Knowing that every attack that we launched or that we conducted that had collateral damage, we created a longer, bigger problem that we then had to solve. And whether we solved it or not is debatable. But with the thought and the critical thinking that goes into this is the person that we need to deal with, we again just to tip the odds of success back into our favor. And that's a lot of what I work on today. It's helping, whether it's the military or security or public safety professionals, make that decision and be prepared when that moment comes to use that force or make those decisions as well as you can, and also be prepared to recognize those changes and to continue operating as well.
And you raised a great point, because I think when people think of emergency management, they often think of what happens after an emergency. I live here in hurricane country, so we're very familiar with, the aftermath of natural disasters. But my guess is that you've incorporated this idea of foresight into your practice as an emergency management professional. I'd love to hear about how you're doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't realize that emergency and disaster management was a field until after I got out of the Marines. I moved from San Diego back to just outside of New York City, not long before Hurricane Sandy had come up the coast, and I saw that for the first time, and also realized that there's a industry and profession around this, and that started a sequence of events that ultimately led me down to working with a lot of agencies today on how they're preparing for disasters and how they're getting left to bang to those. And when oftentimes when people ask about left to bang, it's in relation to threat recognition, it's in relation to violence, but you look at the consequences and the impacts of some of these, call them natural disasters, but that we've seen. This past July 4th, Alex, 135 people died in Texas. More people died in the flooding in Texas than in Hurricane Harvey. Last year, 2024, Hurricane Helene, which you're obviously familiar with, I think around somewhere between 175 and 250 fatalities, over 100 of which were in Western North Carolina. The hurricane did not make landfall in Western North Carolina. This was a storm that was forecast, and this was days after, and we still had these problems. 2023, over 100 people died in Maui in the Lahaina fire, and we can keep going year after year. And even we just passed the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. 1,400 people died. 2024, a cyber attack in London resulted in a fatality of a patient, right? A cyber attack directly attributed to the death of someone. And, when I think about that, and for me, my moment was September 11th, that shifted, kind of the path that I was on. But when you take all of these events, and we didn't even mention the countless school shootings and mass shootings that we're seeing right now, I can't accept that this is simply acceptable or that this is a cost of living in America. Right? I think we can do better. And recognizing that these left to bang principles were not limited just to threat recognition, but they can be working and helping these organizations prepare for any type of incident, any type of disaster. And that's what I think, as a citizen, but just also, resident, professional, we should be demanding of our agencies of knowing how are we getting ahead of these incidents, because very rarely are they true surprises. There's oftentimes a lot of pre-event indicators that let us know that we should change our posture, but we have to define what those warning signs are and define those thresholds where we're not going to just continue to watch. We're going to begin to take action proactively and begin to work through those plans and those capabilities and be able to implement them at the pace that our community and our country should be demanding and in the pace that it deserves.
So sometimes it actually feels like we're living, or I should say reliving, the 1960s, where public discourse devolved into a lot of violence, whether it's civil unrest or targeted type assassinations, or even just random violent crimes that take on a deep significance because of the cultural context in which they occur. So, when you look at the headlines from day to day and they're just terrible, what do you feel are the main takeaways or the implications from a personal security perspective, or even from an institutional perspective, that as you say, things that should be done, what are those things?
I was just writing some pieces about this kind of recently in a newsletter, and I was saying that violence is a choice, right? People are choosing to conduct these attacks. But there's also, in my opinion, the choice that society makes. And it's these choices that are going to determine what happens next. And this is something, that I'm thinking a lot about, these times. So I'm going to answer this in a bit of a roundabout way, Alex. But if I don't, answer it, please don't let me off the hook either. With each high profile, high attention attack, we are going to, eventually lose the ability to choose how we protect ourselves as a country. Because after an attack occurs, when we are already right of bang, people demand answers, and they're demanding solutions more frequently and more at a higher intensity than maybe they have in the past. And the more people that learn that getting left of bang is an option, the more they're going to demand that of our government agencies and elected officials and our security teams. And when we think about, well, what are the impacts of this? If humans, right, if we choose to not be aware of our surroundings and identify these attackers, because there are pre-event indicators more often than not, then we're going to begin losing our ability to do this and kind of delegating that to technology. AI tools today can do a lot more of this than they ever have before. And there's going to be impacts on privacy. But think about how many security cameras are across the country and in our cities. It's not long before people are tired of letting this attack happen, and they just start to demand answers. I'm not saying that the technology is a right or wrong answer. I don't know. But it's going to be the only option unless people start to take ownership of this problem and start to identify proactively and stop these attacks, especially if they have knowledge or they're in a position to observe and actually intervene. And so that's, thinking about these attacks, the decisions that are made right of bang, they're emotional and they're urgent, as they should be. But oftentimes those choices aren't also balanced with what is best long-term, or what is the best strategic option to actually stopping these either. And so that's just something I'm aware of and thinking a lot more about recently in terms of, well, how is the country and society going to choose whether we accept this or not? And if we don't accept this, what is the way forward that we're going to take?
Well, I think you bring up a great point, which is how far left of bang can you go? Because, certainly like England, the United Kingdom, they've gone that route with the omnipresent surveillance cameras and kind of the big brother approach. And I know that, I don't know specifically in the United Kingdom, but I know here in the United States, there are police forces and other agencies that are working on predictive technology, right? Like saying, okay, these are the hot spots, and even these particular individuals may be likely to commit crime. And getting into the minority report type of scenario that people have, it gives you kind of a funny feeling, right? But you're talking about a point sort of just left of bang, if you will, where somebody's already been radicalized, they've decided, or they are in the process of deciding to commit violence. How do we get further left of bang and address the breakdowns, the psychological, the emotional, the societal breakdowns that are causing the radicalization, the polarization, the hatred that are feeding this trend? Because you can be very good at playing whack-a-mole, but you're still playing whack-a-mole as long as the moles are coming, right? To extend the analogy. So in your practice and the way you think, how far left of bang do you go?
There's two answers to this. And so first is the behaviors that we teach are designed to recognize a person with violent intent. And I say that very specifically, but we are focusing on intent over ideology. We're focusing on intent over the weapon used in the attack or the location or potential victims. The approach that was created in the Marines and that we wrote about in the book, it's very specific to a person with violent intent. That means where that picks up is at the moment that person makes the decision, I am going to commit that attack. Or it's the moment that the hurricane forms off the coast of Africa, or it's the moment that cyber attacker chooses, okay, we're going to start probing these networks. There's a moment when that choice begins and intention occurs. When we think about true long-term, left to bang, that's a different, to very much your point, that's a different component of how are you influencing people to not make that choice. And I don't know, Alex, that is hard. It's a choice of society, whether accepting we are of different views, whether we respond to incidents with negativity and blame, or if we start to look for solutions of how are we not going to let that happen again. But the next step is creating conditions where people do not make that choice. And I wish there was an easy answer. I wish I had the answer to that, but that is the next step, that if we're going to get left to bang as a country, we're going to have to figure out as well if we're going to start to calm down just the dynamic that we're seeing over the past few years. We say past few years, I don't have an exact starting point, but just the anger and the frustration and how quickly people go kind of through this process.
So does any of what you're seeing now here in the West remind you of what you saw when you were deployed overseas and dealing with, the radical kind of extremism and violence over there?
Sometimes, right? And it's the orientation and perspective of, are we looking backwards or are we looking forward? And, one of the things that I, learned a lot about, the cultures we were preparing to deploy to was the role of history that plays into their decisions and that plays into choices over alliances and friendship or relations. We'll take this out of violence, just for a second. Think of wildfires out west right now, specifically the ones that are that are being highly likely started by utility companies, or not even the companies, their equipment. This is a really complex problem. We know that we can say definitively that utility equipment has started fires in the past due to not being maintained or no upkeep or just dated. We also know that wind specifically, you look at the LA fires this past January, that those dramatically increase the chances of utility equipment starting fires. I can make an informed assumption that utilities have not done the work, oftentimes on all of their equipment that should have been maintained. I can also make an informed assumption that the public probably doesn't want to pay for that maintenance either. And when I talk about the difference between looking backwards or looking forwards, right now, right there, and there's a number of states who are demanding of utilities they create public safety power shutoff plans. How do you turn off and de-energize the grid when their high wind event is forecasted to make sure that your equipment doesn't start a fire? Well, there are incredible consequences that come from that. Hospitals and critical infrastructure facilities, have to go to backup power. Think about their continuity of care. In high heat times, no AC in some of these areas. In Maui, during the Lahaina fires, I think if I remember reading in a report, the public safety response and the fire department request was to not shut down the lines because they needed electricity to power the pumps that was putting water on the flames. And so there was a request to keep power on, even though these winds were really extreme once the fires began. And so I mentioned this because there's no easy answer to this. We are in this, these are the conditions that we have today. Whether it can start fires through utilities. If we're just going to blame the utilities for not doing the maintenance, and we're not going to fund it, and we're just going to turn off the power and let those consequences go, what is the way forward? And I think we need to shift just as a culture to saying, okay, we can't change the past right now, but we do need to think rationally, and we do need to think about this together of how are we going to deal with it without, creating a system where there's not just haves and have-nots, but that is upgrading the maintenance or figuring out how do you make sure that we can keep power on without causing fires, without putting people at risk. And these are not easy answers. But the same can be done when you think about some of the violence issues as well. The past is the past, and we can dwell on it and blame and point fingers, or we can take them as conditions and assumptions and facts that this is where we're starting today, maybe define a path forward that gets people out of this point of choosing violence or allowing these conditions to persist.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're talking about physical violence, and it makes me wonder about your perspective on cognitive warfare, narrative warfare. We hear a lot about disinformation, misinformation, these kind of psychological operations that are conducted by either adversarial states or extremist groups or what have you, and a lot of it is online. And it's kind of like your wildfire scenario, right? Because like we have this problem, right, of let's say information or disinformation that feeds polarization and hatred, but is the cure worse than the disease, right? Like you're saying, if you turn off the power, then your hospitals are dark. Same way, if we allow, infringement on discourse in the public square, online, is that not worse than having bad information, right? So, what's your perspective on not just physical violence, but also, let's say aggression? Okay, aggression that takes place within the cognitive or information realm.
It's a challenge, right? Because when we think about what went into Left of Bang, what we were teaching deploying Marines was how do you make decisions with that are more often right than wrong, decisions that you can make with a very limited amount of information, a very limited amount of time to be able to recognize those attackers and not get caught. And the behaviors that we were teaching were designed to be objective indicators of a person's intentions, ultimately to speed up that decision-making cycle so Marines were not right of bang. When we think about how people consume information today, if it's garbage in, or if it's incorrect or unfactual information coming in, it either delays the decision-making process because you have to sort out what is true, what is not true, what is signal, what is noise. That slows down the process. And also while dealing with the reality that it's really hard to know what is real and what isn't. And I think as you go back into it, there's a number of frameworks, and there's some people who are they're doing some great work on, I see it on Substack today, a guy named Mark McGrath who writes a lot about the OODA loop, and John Boyd, who looks at structures to break down, these messages and get a better sense of, can we trust this? What is the angle? Why are people sharing this message? How do they choose the medium? To just, again, shift those scales back from being a victim or being on the receiving end or unable to look at what we're receiving and go, why am I receiving this? How am I reacting to it? And maybe hone in on maybe better ways to think about those articles, those social media posts, or however else you're consuming information today to, again, ultimately make a better decision coming out of this.
Yeah, you raise a great point about we don't know what's true. And I'm seeing more commentators kind of point this out, that as a human society, we've never faced this before, where we truly have no way of knowing whether we can trust our own eyes, right? If we see a video of something happening, we don't know. Like, it could be deepfake, it could be AI, it could be computer generated in some way, shape, or form that we can't detect anymore. It's gotten to that point. And you've mentioned being trapped in the past and the idea of being a victim. And one of the things that I've heard about cognitive warfare, especially within the realm of radicalization, is that it's almost always, probably actually always, based around a victimhood narrative, right? Because if you feel that you are under attack, now that justifies you retaliating, right? And if you feel that your existence or your life is under threat, then that gives you, under sort of the as far back as you go in human history, right? if someone is coming to kill you, then you can rise up and kill them first. And I think you saw it in the Middle East when you were over there. Unfortunately, we're seeing it in the West today. And as you say, it's not limited to any particular ideology. It's on all sides, which is, a pretty big concern, I think, for thinking people. As you say, there are no easy answers either. But as somebody who's dedicated your life to this idea of foresight, of helping to protect people, what do you think are the key things that people should keep in mind, both for themselves and their communities, let's say at a local level?
Your question reminds me of one of the, I got out of the military, it was one of my very first clients who wanted training. And it was this suburban school district, a well-off community in Long Island. And I had never taught non-infantry Marines prior to this. And short version is I have never failed as a presenter as much as I did with that audience. And I sat down with this principal who brought me in for probably it was supposed to be a 4-hour workshop. We didn't get it that long before the principal's like, okay, we're done with this. Probably spent another 5 or 6 hours with him after. And we talked a lot about the audience. And he was talking to me about, no teachers, and this was 2012. This was not right around the Newtown timeframe, became teachers to go recognize threats. They are here because they want to teach. They're here because they want to help. And this current environment of school shootings is simply the environment they have to do it in. And we stopped and we went through all the behaviors that I typically teach. And I talked about how those can help a teacher read their students, understand if their lesson was getting across to them, or if there was something else, challenges that were preventing the lesson from getting through, or if there's interpersonal conflict between students, and to use it to help teachers become better at their chosen profession. And then at the very end of the workshop, now we can tie it into threat recognition. These same behaviors, that can help you understand your kids and understand where they are today and understand how to, get through them, can then also help with this. And it really changed the way I thought about a lot of these behaviors, because when we see someone, if our baseline is people who are comfortable and we're observing someone who is uncomfortable, it doesn't mean that they're definitely an attacker. It's an option, but they could also have just had a fight with a friend or family member. They could be anxious and nervous about something they have today that they feel unprepared for. There's also legitimate reasons for that behavior. And when you take a step back, you realize that these behaviors could be violent or they could be nonviolent. It just opens up this box in your mind and lets you ask the question of, well, why? And it can let you be very empathetic and understanding. Hey, what's going on today? Like, anything I can help you with? How are things at home? Why I can see you're a little bit nervous, if you want to explicitly call it out. But it can also be done from a very caring perspective of wanting to help someone else. And I think about that, in our society, in our community, these behaviors and just this awareness of other and this very intentional awareness of others doesn't always have to be, to stop the attack. It can also just be to be a better neighbor or be a better friend or be a better spouse or family member or anything like that. Just by putting down the phone, caring about those around us. And then when you care about it, you naturally put that energy and the attention into really look at these behaviors. What am I seeing? What does it mean? How can I use this information to make a better decision going forward? And I think that can help a lot because right now, when you have everyone that is angry, recognizing threats becomes really hard. Right? If everyone's angry, we're now trying to find the really angry or, separate out the people who are a little bit less angry. That's hard to do when you're a single security provider, a single, parent, trying to protect your family in a crowded area. It's much easier if everyone is calm and happy and comfortable, recognizing those attackers. And so when people talk about lowering the temperature, doing these different things, the more happy, the more comfortable, the more calm people are, our ability to get left to bang is going to go up because those attackers, it's going to become more obvious that there is something different about them. But, it just starts with that awareness and starts with just being thoughtful about those around us, which can't happen, when your face is buried in this either. And I say that I'm just as guilty, sometimes, but it's an intentional act to put it down, put it in your pocket and turn your attention back to people.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned Jeff Cooper's condition yellow, which is relaxed awareness, right? Awareness is mutually exclusive with being absorbed in a glowing screen. But what you said a minute ago about kind of reading the room reminded me of George Thompson's verbal judo, where he said that empathy is the most important or most powerful word in the English language, because not only does it help you deal with situations that could turn into, dangerous confrontations, but also just in everyday life to help the people around you, to connect with the people around you. And in fact, it's kind of funny because it's almost like your experience was a case in point, right? You had spent however many years in the Marine Corps, and now you're trying to talk to teachers the way you would talk to your Marines. And presumably you're watching yourself lose the room, seeing their behavior change, but
Having no idea how to stop it either, right? I was over my head.
So that's the follow-up question, right? If you know that, hey, I'm talking to this person and I see them, like they're getting upset, they're getting uncomfortable, I'm not sure what to do about that. How do you take a step back and just, like, is there a safe square to return to in most situations if you're let's say having a conversation with somebody or in like your situation?
The way I work with clients today, where I have no problem today, and this was very different than just out of the military me, however many years ago, where I have no problem stopping saying, did I just offend someone? I said this, I saw, people's reaction change. There might be some understanding, or I might have said something unintentionally. And I just call it out and just, kind of figure out where we are. And maybe it's just age, Alex, or, that comes with recognizing that versus a younger version of me that just go, no, I still have the course. I still know what I'm going to teach. I'm going to go forward 1,000 miles per hour regardless. And then fail. I don't know. But, it comes down to having the options and knowing the sooner you recognize that. I mean, Alex, I played a video of a suicide bomber attack to a bunch of teachers in this community that was not at all concerned about suicide bombers in their building, right? It just, I don't know. It was not unnecessary. This was how we gained attention and kind of showed the importance of consequences, but it was just a different environment. And realizing I could have stopped that very early and probably paused and said, I think I just made a mistake. Let's talk about this. Instead, I just went forward and had a very short workshop, nothing else.
It makes me think that perhaps the experts on this would be stand-up comedians, because no one's better at reading a room than a comedian who realizes, hey, I just lost the crowd. Like, I got to get them back. And having options for these are the ways I've done this in the past versus, I think I'll just keep going forward. Ignore it. So what would you say are the things, good or bad, that you see on the horizon for the next few years, if you're going to put your forecaster cap on?
There's two that come to mind. When the Marine Corps' Combat Hunter program was being developed, prevention really wasn't an option. There were not many resources on this. There wasn't a lot of awareness that this was possible. As the book's been out for over 11 years at this point. As there is more awareness in certain respects, it helps it's like breaking the 4-minute mile barrier, where a lot of organizations now realize it's possible. And as more organizations realize it's possible, they're putting their own spin out. They're looking at technology and training and education, all these different components to figure out, for the risks and the threats or the hazards they care about, what are we doing? And that takes time to build those capabilities. It starts with the recognition that it's possible. But the number of conversations we're having with organizations who are saying, we cannot let this happen again. We cannot accept this, and we're going to make the change, and we're going to invest in the change, and we're going to commit to it, feels like it's continuing to go up. And that gives me a lot of hope, because once, I truly believe there's a lot of really smart, intelligent people in our country. Once you help them scope the problem and define the problem, it'll be solved someday. And I don't believe that these conditions and this situation is, indefinite, that there'll be no end to it. We just have to keep getting the word out there, letting people know it's possible. There's plenty of case studies across a number of different industries, from military to public safety to security, schools, hospitals, businesses who've applied these concepts in different ways to achieve success. And the more those get out there, the more other organizations are going, yeah, we should do that too. They did it, we can do it. Let's go for it. And I think that is a huge step forward, a huge opportunity. And the other thing that I think goes into this too, it's oftentimes my work has me around, a level of organizations maybe just below the executives. There are some up and coming leaders in our public safety and security and business environment that I am incredibly impressed by, and that as they come into more leadership roles and more executive roles, there's a lot more people thinking about this than maybe their predecessors had. And so I think as there's some natural turnover in these fields, and as this next generation of leaders steps up, I think there's lots of opportunities to implement change across a wide swath of the country, which I think will again just tip those scales into not being right of bang, not being reactive, not accepting everything that comes when we're reactive to an attack, but actually putting in the work to shift those scales and begin to move our organizations, our communities back left of bang where we should be.
Yeah, fantastic, Patrick. And that does sound very optimistic. I recently read for the first time Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which is terrific. I really recommend it to everybody.
I'll pick it up, yeah.
Yeah, so he was, if you're not familiar with it, he was a psychiatrist who was imprisoned by the Nazis in Auschwitz. And so he spent several years there and as a prisoner. And he had this sort of epiphany after a while there where he saw himself, sort of had this kind of vision of himself in the future in a comfortable, well-lit conference room, a lecture hall, where he's giving a lecture to an attentive audience on the psychology of concentration camps. And that idea gave him reason to live, right? Because he was like, I'm going to observe what's happening here. And when I get out, clinically, I'm going to clinically observe what's happening here as a psychiatrist. When I get out, I'm going to explain what happened with the prisoners, with the guards, and that's exactly what he did. And that experience gave him the conviction that what matters and what gives people a reason to live is meaning and fulfillment in what they're doing. And when we talk about violence and feeling like this is what you have to do, right? Like, well, because I'm a victim and so I need to lash out. One of the things he said was that the last freedom that you have as a human being, the thing that can never be taken away from you, is the freedom to choose your attitude in any circumstance. He said, even in a concentration camp, you can choose how you respond. You can't control what happens to you. You can't control how anybody else feels. And that's something that's relevant, not just in, life or death situation, but even in everyday interpersonal situations too. Hey, this person's upset. Maybe somebody close to you. I can't control that, and I shouldn't try to control that. What I need to, what control means in that circumstance is controlling how I respond. And I think if we can have more of that on both an individual and a societal level, we might get to a better place, certainly than we are today.
And one of the things that, when I mentioned I came back from my deployments, and then I saw the Combat Hunter course and I was angry, one of the things that shifted things for me was recognizing that, there was a process, there was a method, there was the ability to break this down and regain that confidence and that control, that we didn't have to be a victim. We didn't have to just wait to get blown up or wait to get shot at. And, for me, right, that shift into recognizing that the how is there absolutely shifted the mindset and the mentality. And I think for a lot of these problems, a lot of these things that are causing divisions and causing people's lives to become irrevocably changed and altered, they don't have to occur this way. And it's possible. And there's a way to do it as well. And hopefully that, gives some people some hope or some focus on where we can shift our energy instead of attacking each other. Well, let's solve the problem.
Right, and there's definitely work to do at the institutional level, right? Like when you have the kind of economic problems that we have, it does provoke a sense of helplessness, which does lead to negative outcomes. There's no doubt about that. But there's something each of us can do. There's something each of us can do to promote life, to promote connection, to promote the sense of community that we need. There were some really interesting experiments done in the 1960s by a guy named John B. Calhoun on rats or mice, and one of them, he had mice in isolation and then mice that were sort of in a kind of a healthy habitat with other mice. And he gave each of them access to morphine-laced water, right? So the rats that were in isolation, and you think back to sort of the COVID era, the rats that were in isolation basically just, knocked themselves out on the morphine-laced water. But the rats that were in kind of a healthy environment with other rats and had, a social environment, really had very little interest in it. And so the conclusion, if you will, from that experiment was that the opposite of addiction is not, freedom from addiction. The opposite is connection. And I think we see that not just in addiction to narcotics, but in addiction to, our screens, addiction to the constant sense of hey, let me just stimulate, give myself sensory stimulation, whether it's through TV or my phone or whatever, just constantly distract myself from what's happening. Or good old-fashioned, alcohol and drugs. But all those things are so negative. And even there's an addiction to anger and to hatred too, right? Because it gives you something. It gives you a feeling that can be intoxicating. I'm curious a little bit, Patrick. You have been, I would say, at least from my perspective, pretty successful in making a transition from the military to the civilian world. But, we know that a lot of veterans do struggle with that transition. And I'm wondering, we have this sense of this growing civilian military divide where there are people who served and who can relate to each other, but don't necessarily feel like the everyday American can relate to their experience, what they've gone through, and doesn't necessarily recognize the value that they bring to the table in, let's say a work environment. Unemployment is very high right now. It's a really difficult labor situation. So, I guess maybe this is a tangent, but as somebody who went from being a Marine to being a professional in a field that you didn't even know existed, as you mentioned, what's your perspective on that for the civilian world and the veterans out there?
It's hard, right? I'll say that, and I've seen this on a few different avenues, where there's three different perspectives. The challenge that many veterans have in the job market, it's technical skills, right? If you're applying for marketing position, you're probably competing against someone who started off at an entry-level marketing role and has systematically worked themselves up and can talk about these different components, or same thing with operations or finance or whatever field that you're in. And that veteran, they learn different technical skills at that early point of their career, but they also learned the leadership and the management and the ability to take some really challenging problems and go forward regardless and operate in uncertainty. They can learn, I think, the technical side of a field much more quickly than you can learn decision-making under pressure and leadership and the ability to read the room and understand this person's on board with the plan, this person is not. I should have a conversation with them after and figure out what to do about it. And I would encourage, when I talk to businesses, I mention this, don't just think about the technical skills. If you're looking for a leader or manager, those director level positions, people can learn that very quickly. And especially when you take people who are comfortable delegating responsibility and delegating actions to those experts. It's not just about, has this person been in this field for 20 years? It's can they lead that organization? That's a very different skill set as well. But, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to, that sense of service and serving something bigger than yours. And I was lucky in the sense where finding disaster management, it's a mission-driven field. You're around people who can create an impact, direct impact on communities and people. And I hope that, a lot of the veterans who are seeking that and searching for that, they can find the field where they can regain that sense of connection to a higher purpose and the mission, and because they're willing to go all in to figure it out and help and contribute. But there's a balance, I think, on both sides, hopefully, of recognizing that, we have some freedom today because of what veterans did, and veterans have some work to do to learn those technical skills and not just rest on laurels, but say, hey, I'm going to learn this, I'm going to learn it more, and I'm going to understand it better than the person who's been doing it for 10 years. And so it's on both sides, but I think this group and this audience, or that, that portion of our, community offers a lot in terms of the leadership and that sense of purpose as well. I don't know if that actually answered your question, Alex, or not, but
I'm not even sure if I had a specific question. I just want to get your thoughts as somebody who's been through that journey, So I guess I want to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate you chatting with me. If there were, one or two things that you wanted to leave people with, that you wanted to make sure people heard about from you, what would those be?
It's recognizing that getting left to bang is possible. And it's not just, hey, do this thing for 10 more years and you're going to become good at it. There's a method. There's the ability to learn this in a compressed time frame and learn what's important. And this is something that I write a lot about on my site, the CP Journal. There's always new resources there to make sure that it's not just something abstract or something that's just intangible. There are concrete steps people can take to shift their life and their community and their organization left to bang. And once you know that it's possible, after that, it's just a choice. And if people want to make that choice or people want to commit to this, there's a lot of free resources out there that can help make that possible for them.
And I know you are very generous with your knowledge and your time. If people want to read some of your work or learn more about this, go ahead and tell us, those websites, those books, whatever you'd like people to know about.
Yeah, so the first is the book, Left to Bang, How the Marine Corps Combat Hunter Program Can Save Your Life. That's available on Amazon, any large retailers. The book has been out almost 11 years now, and we're still very humbled by the number of people that we hear and talk with who've had been able to apply these concepts. And for people who are looking for more up-to-date resources, our website, the CP Journal, which is cp-journal.com. We are constantly writing about different components and different aspects about getting left to bang at all levels, whether individual, organizational, or with your community. And with that, hopefully we can help people find that way or find those skills, that ability to do it in their life and what matters to them.
And you do have a Substack as well, right?
Same one. So it's the Substack is just the CP Journal. Yeah.
What does CP stand for?
In the Marine Corps, what we talk about as behavioral analysis was called combat profiling. And Alex, my first website was combatprofiling.com. One of the first pitches I ever did was to a large metropolitan police department. This was like 2011, 2012 timeframe. And I told him, he goes, it was combatprofiling.com, and he probably kicked me out. He's like, you think I can buy something with the words combat or profiling in it? You're out of your mind. And so I overnight, before going back in, changed the website from combat profiling to CP Journal. For some reason, I have a dash in there, which I regret today, but we're not going to change it. And so it's just a nod to the history of where this came from and where it originated.
That's good. That's really good. I'm a little sorry I asked now. I kind of aired your dirty laundry, but that was...
It's all good. It made me laugh. Like, it was one of the first business lessons before this elementary school of better think about the audience, better think about the customers as we're designing it.
Valuable lessons in marketing there. How is your stuff going to be perceived? All right. Well, Patrick, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. Hopefully we can chat chat again soon. And we wish you the best of luck with everything, and be keeping an eye on your stuff.
Thank you.